Welcome to Jumpstart Your Joy. This week on the show, I'm so honored to have Chris Freimuth on. He is a student at Yale Divinity School, and in the past, he has owned an amazing gardening business in New York City called CF Garden. And he also put in an amazing garden around the Yale Divinity School Labyrinth. And that is how we were introduced. I could not be more excited to have you on. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I could not be more excited to be here. I honestly, I feel very, very honored.
Yeah, I mean, this is really an exciting interview for me, and I hope the listeners love it too. I'd like to explain that Chris and I have forged a friendship, and it is very sweet, and I am totally delighted to have him on, even though we've just gotten to know each other really recently. We got put in touch through Yale Divinity School around the labyrinth itself there. Currently, as of the time of this recording, Chris and I are working on putting together a presentation that we'll be giving together in person. And it's for the Yale 25th reunion or the 50th reunion, depending on which year you graduated. I'd be the 25th. And the thing about this is that as the Alumni Association announced that they would be having this reunion, I just kind of took the big bold step and asked if I could lead a labyrinth walk as part of the convocation and reunion celebration. And much to my surprise, they said yes. And they said there's this really nice gentleman who recently redesigned the Labyrinth Garden. And would you like to lead with him for this presentation? And I said yes. And that is how we met.
That's right. We're like the newest, oldest friends in the world.
Yeah, it's so good. Well, so let's dive right in. I mean, what originally drew you to gardening? I would love for you to share whatever you feel kind of like sets the stage
Sure.
for
Yeah.
this discussion and your love of gardening.
I grew up in Northwest Connecticut, which is super rural. I grew up in a small town. So I just, from an early age, I was outdoors all the time. So I just really, I mean, not everyone that grew up in the outdoors likes the outdoors, but some people do. And I'm one of those people. And I moved in my 20s. I sort of enjoyed the maxim of like enjoy your 20s, and then when you turn 30, like get your act together. So I did that. So when I turned 30, I moved to New York City. I wasn't really wanting or planning to move to New York City, but for various reasons I did. And it's such a big urban place, obviously. And for someone who likes to be outdoors among the trees and the waterways and stuff, it can feel a little bit uncomfortable. So prior to that, the sort of two professional threads that I could tug on, one was massage therapy and body work in general, and the other was farming and gardening. I had done sort of like a medium amount of work in both of those areas. So I thought, okay, I need to get my act together. I'm in this new city. So should I sort of professionalize in body work or should I professionalize in gardening? And truly, because I was in this urban place, I said, let me like orient every part of my life that I can around the outdoors. So I chose horticulture as a way to build in an outdoor life. And so I went to school for 2 years at the New York Botanical Garden and started my own business. And in New York, there's not a lot of gardeners. You know, not a lot of people move to New York to pursue gardening. And there's a lot of people who have, oddly enough, there's a lot of terraces and penthouses and brownstone backyards. So there actually is a lot of space to garden and money to pay for that gardening. So it, for me, was actually a pretty seamless entry into building a business.
I love that. And I did spend some time on your website last night,
Oh, cool.
like perusing the photos of some of the work that you've done in New York City. I could really see both in how you described the gardens that you've created in New York City, but also in the photos and the way that you presented your own work. It really feels like a lot of what you were working to do is find that connection point for a client of how do I, in this urban setting, also have a connection back to something that's bigger than me. Do you feel like that's what you were after, or is that just kind of organic to what it is that you do?
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, gardening is not just like a pretty thing. It's not just like quote unquote art, not whatever, not that art for the sake of art isn't incredible. But for me, that's not what I was drawn to. I'm drawn to the meaning inside of gardening. both in terms of like creating ecological habitats for non-human creatures. Like we've taken away so many habitats, so maybe I could just like do the tiniest bit to give back. And then on a spiritual level, I mean, mind, body, spirit integration, it just feels like gardening is so obviously a deeply spiritual practice. So if I could share that with my clients, through the way I design, through the way I interact with them, through the plants that I choose, through the vendors that I purchase from, then, what a gift to all of us.
Yeah. Oh, I like that you're talking about it being throughout, like the whole, not to make a pun, but the ecosystem, that each decision is beyond just like the color of the plant, but you're also really thinking about the people that then supply the plant. Like it's really lovely that you take all of that into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I truly, yeah, if you think about everything you touch has touched so many other things. So,
Yeah. I mean, and it's magical because, like, out this window, I created a very simple fountain, but it's become a bird bath.
oh, cool.
And it's so sweet to see because every day there's a couple of scrub jays that come and they make this call. And then I come to look out the window and it's like, oh my gosh, my friends are here. But it's so sweet because then there's like this space and there's this relationship between both like me living here and everything else that inhabits this space. And also, like here at our house, we found during the pandemic that there were 2 great northern harriers, which are just big hawks that live here, and it was so fun to, like, hear them calling, and you could see them flying with their younglings out there, and, like, all the neighbors would come out of our houses and look up just to delight in these northern harriers that were flying around when we were all, stuck in our homes for so long.
Have you ever seen that on YouTube, that video from like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, the double rainbow guy?
Okay.
I think you're going to love it. It really was, it went viral. And anyway, it's this guy, he's like out in the wilderness somewhere, it's somewhere out west, I think. And he sees this rainbow that's like a full arch of a rainbow, and he starts losing his mind because he's so excited about it. And then he realizes it's a double rainbow, and he like truly loses his mind. He's crying and he's like, but what does it mean? And I feel like so many of the people that I talked to about that video back when it was really viral, they thought it was funny. And I just was like, I don't know, man. I feel like that guy.
Yes.
I'm like,
Yeah, by the creation and all the magic and the mystery of it. I mean, it's funny, isn't it?
yeah.
And maybe that's one of our pieces of connection too, is like it's easy to just get in and see a garden, but it's really so much more. Like nature is so much more. Because I really love some of the formal gardens near us, like Philoli. But it's beautiful to see, but it's like when I go and look at them, it's like, how did someone paint with all of these plants?
Yeah.
And I think that might be a really good segue because there's something clearly for you that it's that these creations are beyond just a garden. So what made you decide to to first apply and later attend Yale Divinity School?
I'll give you the medium story, which is so I'm 40 now. 40 years old. I applied to divinity school when I was like 24 in California. And I just felt at that time that I was too young to go to divinity school. And the only reason I say this is because like this desire has been with me for at least half of my life. And just because I'm interested in question, I'm not particularly religious. I don't have a religious affiliation, but I'm just so curious about questions like, why are we here? What does it mean? Why is everything so painful? um, like what is love? Like, what is that feeling? Like, what is it? It's so big and real. And so not necessarily to have answers to these questions. I just really want to play around with them. But anyway, at that age, I hadn't had an enormous amount of life experience that was terribly like gritty. I had never been in love. I had never been broken up with. I hadn't experienced any major deaths. And so I just felt at that time like if I went to school for this, the questions would be way too intellectual for me. And I wanted them to be like full bodied. So I went off and did what I did for quite a long time. And to answer your question, I came back because in 2020, the pandemic hit, of course. I was in New York. I hadn't actually wanted to be in New York, as I said earlier. So I was I was sort of looking for a way to leave. My partner, my sort of long-term partner, and I separated, and he was the primary reason I was in New York, along with my business. But my business, I was also starting to feel a little bit disillusioned with. So it was all of these factors sort of came together at once, and it was like, well, I mean, obviously, this is the time. So I applied, and I'm from Connecticut. My family lives in Connecticut, and so I wanted to be a little bit closer to them. And here I am.
Yeah, that's amazing because I think so many of us have felt that there's that thing, that there's something else out there, and maybe it's big and scary, and yet we're drawn to it, and we wanna know the answers to the question, or something out there's calling us. And we gotta know we have to listen at some point, or we probably should at least.
Yeah, I remember when I was applying and going to like open houses. Again, so when I was applying, I was probably 23. And I remember going to these open houses and there would be like people who were like 30, 35, 40 years old. And I was just like, and they were saying like, I felt called to do this for so many years and I resisted the call and here I am. And I just was like, you people are so old. That's crazy that you had the patience to like keep hearing this call and sort of like put it on the shelf for whatever reasons, either because of fear or just because you had a job and a family and stuff. Um, but then I turned out to be that same person,
Same old person. I'm kidding.
same old man.
Yeah, and it's funny, and because I don't really talk that much about divinity school here. I went to YDS 2 years out of undergrad, so I was 24 or something, so that age. And I mean, the air quotes reason that I thought I went was that I really wanted to teach the Old Testament. And that's totally where I was headed, and so one of my professors who had attended Yale, not the divinity school, he had attended and taught at Yale, I think, not the divinity school, but he was in ancient Near East studies, but he said, "Well, maybe you should try the master's degree because just to see what you think, because it's a really great path to getting into a PhD program." Then I got into Yale Divinity School and started working on that master's, and then started hearing these stories of people were spending another than 7 to 9 years, just to get the next degree to teach, and it was already so impacted that you might not even get in as a professor anywhere.
Right. Yeah. And that's only gotten worse.
Yeah, and then you're overqualified for everything, and so I stayed for the 2 years, and I'm an MAR, which is Master of Arts in Religion, and then maybe one of the parallels is that I got pulled back in because I was going through a divorce, and my best friend said, "Well, why don't you just come on this retreat?" And that was the first time that I ever walked a labyrinth. And so it was really funny that I did literally get just called right back to spirituality. And then I became really dear friends with one of the Franciscans there, Father Rusty, and he kept inviting me to come back and lead retreats with him. And so it was this really interesting dance of just like listening and then deciding to say yes when it was right to come back to things that seemed to be aligned with what I wanted to do.
Right. It's so cool how that listening, it really does pan out.
Yeah, and there's wisdom because I think I needed the container of the Old Testament and then the New Testament to realize what in the world I wanted to do with it.
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, I should say, because sometimes when I say that, like for me, when I was 24, I knew I wasn't ready. Divinity school is full of people who are 24. So I don't mean to ever say, of course, like, and therefore I think that you're not ready or something. Like, because I also can imagine going at 24 and getting such a rich framework for how to live life and be able to put life experiences in that framework rather than what I did, which was bring life experiences to that framework. You know what I mean? It's sort of like a win-win, but for me, it's sort of what I did made sense for me. But
Yeah, well, and I think that there's the metaphor of the labyrinth that's gonna pop in here, but that's, like, always the path, right? Like, where you are, like, when you're walking along, you might be parallel with someone on the labyrinth path for a little while, but then they take a different turn, and you're not parallel at all. But, yeah, so I think it's interesting, and I loved my time at Yale.
yeah, I've been shocked by Yale. I really, growing up in Connecticut, I mean, I'm sure this is not just people who grew up in Connecticut because Yale is a global phenomenon, but I just was like, Yale, ugh, it's going to be full of a bunch of like stuck up, annoying people, as if I'm not stuck up and annoying. And it's just full of incredibly kind, incredibly intelligent, very thoughtful human beings. It's such a wonderful place.
I mean, it was really lovely to meet so many interesting people. You definitely do run into those people that are like, "Oh, Ivy League." And I'm like, "But yeah, but that wasn't my experience of it." Although I did have someone at orientation say, "Wait a minute. Until now, you've only gone to public schools?"
That's Yale. There it is.
And I'm like, "Yeah, like that's awesome."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I do think YDS is one of the more down to earth places that I'd ever run into. And it's really that inquiry about life's big questions, at least at the Divinity School. And it's so thorough and earnest. And so, I mean, coming from this heartfelt place that I'd never really been before, I'll put some of the photos if you guys are looking at the video version of this. But if not, you can head over to the show notes. I'll link to some of the photos of the YDS Labyrinth. And Chris, I would love for you to share like what drew you to the space and, like, clearly it called out to you. What's the story behind that?
Well, I'll give you another medium story. So I got to the Divinity School, obviously in the fall, and one of my first classes was on preaching with this professor, Carolyn Sharp, who I just adore. So the class was preaching for creation. So it was all about preaching along ecological themes. And we were to do book reports on some book that sort of talked about that theme. And my book that I chose was The Well Gardened Mind, I think, by Stuart Smith is her last name. So I was reading this book and it's all about horticultural therapy. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do, instead of a written book report, do some sort of like project? Because I'm always trying to think of how to not just write a paper that will go nowhere. Yale Divinity School has this like large front quad and then front like quad space, and then a couple of smaller courtyards in the back. And these courtyards in the back had been redesigned in 2019 by a landscape architecture firm. And the stereotype of landscape architecture firms is that they don't actually know a ton about plants. They know all about hardscaping and design. And then the stereotype of garden designers, like myself, is that we know all about plants, but we don't know anything about hardscaping or any of the sort of like technical engineering parts of creating a garden. So if that stereotype is true, then in this case, it was a case study of that stereotype, because the design of the space and the hardscaping and all of that was done in 2019 was lovely, but the planting plan was so boring. And it was just grass and some ferns and a couple of serviceberry trees. It was like very sort of sterile and modern. I think they were going for this like modern, clean look, but it just looked, in my opinion, boring. And it was sort of like one note, not a lot of variation or sort of, there wasn't like a story.
Okay, and just for context, the courtyard back there, it's got pretty high walls all around it, if you're listening. And it's kind of, at least when I was there, a pretty harsh space that didn't feel very inspired. So if somebody had just dropped a labyrinth back there, it would have felt too hot in the summer and like way too cold in the winter. And there's just no buffer to that area at all. So that's kind of what you started with.
Correct. Yeah. It sort of felt sort of emotionally cold or boring. So surrounded on four sides by brick buildings with between those four buildings, 50 different windows staring down into this courtyard, which in 2019, part of the new design had a labyrinth in it, which I thought was really pretty cool of them. And the idea that the school had intended was that this courtyard would be a sort of meditative, quiet space. And then its neighboring courtyard, there is a pair of courtyards. The other courtyard would be more social. There's like tables and chairs and outlets and all of that. So there's this labyrinth in this garden, but because the planting plan is so sort of low and boring, there's 50 windows looking down into the labyrinth. And so if you're like trying to like get vulnerable and have your meditative experience and like sort of like get in there with yourself, you know that there's like 50 windows with peering eyes. Probably most people aren't staring at those windows, but they could be. So it's just like hard to like get into the zone when you're being surveilled. So there were just so many reasons. And the garden was doing nothing for local ecology. I mean, there was like no birds in there, no pollinators. So it just was a sort of like underutilized space. This labyrinth is like has such a powerful gravitational force, but the garden around it is so blah that it's kind of a mixed message. And what if the garden could represent what the labyrinth offers? And then, like, what a dynamic space that would be. For this book report, I just created a redesign of the garden just as a way of being like, here's an example of how we could use horticultural therapy here at YDS. And then I shared that with one of the deans at the school, who's like one of the incredibly friendly, very supportive deans. And she said, oh, you should share this with one of the sort of upper level administrators, who turns out also to be one of the kindest people I've ever met. And I just was like, this idea is like cute for me. I just got here a month ago. Like, this is great. I'm a garden designer, whatever. But like, this is Yale. They're never going to let me like have any kind of like big impact like this. And so short story long, long story short, the garden is there right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just love this. And it's such a labor of love to see that something deserves or is calling for more, whatever that verb might be, because that really, I mean, the quiet itself is beautiful. And anyone that's studying there or has been drawn to the quad itself and they find themselves at this labyrinth, I think to have made it a softer place is like one of the most beautiful things because you're right. You don't want 50 people like watching you walk and kind of think out life's hard thoughts. Or if you're just being meditative, like whatever you're doing that day, you just need some quiet and space for that.
Right. Totally. It's been a great experience. It is cool. The other thing is that I'm not a Christian, and Yale Divinity School is very open, but it can be hard to navigate as a non-Christian, and especially as a new student, just kind of not understanding everybody's motivations. And basically, when I got there, I felt a lot more defensive than maybe I needed to, because the school sort of presents itself as pretty Christian. And so that can feel a little bit lonely for a non-Christian. I have since realized that it's a lot more friendly and open-minded and diverse and intersectional than I had at first feared. But especially in those first couple months, the labyrinth drew me because although this particular style of labyrinth is a traditionally Christian design, the labyrinth as a archetype in general is just so much bigger. And so I just felt like for myself, I really needed, and I knew that I wasn't alone, I really needed to interact with a spiritual space that was bigger than Christianity. So it has been such a life-giving project for me. It has like completely changed my path in that regard.
That's, I think, part of why I love the labyrinth so much is I mean, like, so by baptism, I'm Christian. I work at a Franciscan retreat center. So there's that. But I also love it because we get a lot of people at the retreat center that are not specifically Christian, but they are drawn to the topic of whatever is at hand. And I feel like the labyrinth, because side note for everyone, it's found in every culture and on every continent in the world, and it predates Christianity by quite a lot. So it isn't something that's just for Christians or limited to Christian use. And there's something about this, this circular path that's like fascinated humans for centuries, millennia. So I think one of the things that I love about it is yes, we can dip into the Christian pieces of it and cite scripture and we can walk with it from something from Proverbs, which we often do. But there's a mindfulness to it that can just work in whatever space that labyrinth is and for whomever shows up.
Yeah, it's true.
And I know, having talked to you about the labyrinth and how you approached it, that you think more of just the landscape, but you also knew that this space had a history. And that kind of informed how you picked the plants and informed what you wanted the space to become. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you approach that and some of the things that maybe feed in and cross over? Like, what's the spiritual story here? What's sacred? Because I love how you've described some of this in the past.
Um, well, the way I have thought about it so much is so there's the Greek story of the labyrinth, which I really appreciate. which should I give a little baby version of
Yeah, I mean, tell whatever tell as much as you want.
that?
I'm happy to talk about our friend.
Yeah, yeah, our friend. So the Minotaur really feels like my Virgil on this path. So the Greeks, so as I was thinking about redesigning the garden, I thought, well, the one thing in this space that I know is must stay, which is an understatement of the year, like not only must stay, but it's the heart of this entire courtyard, is the labyrinth. So I thought, let me learn more about the labyrinth. So the Greek story of the labyrinth is that there's a king, he's given a bull to sacrifice to the gods, and he doesn't sacrifice this bull. So the gods get very angry with him, and they trick his wife into falling in love with the bull and producing a love child, which is the Minotaur, head of a bull, body of a man. So the king is so distraught and angry about having this like monster as a child that he throws the Minotaur into a labyrinth underground and feeds him human bodies every so many number of years. So what a cruel fate to give to this child. The Minotaur is often portrayed as this like angry, violent, man-eating beast that like you should be afraid of. So one of these years, this young man, Theseus, comes from Athens, and he comes to the island where this labyrinth is, and he falls in love with the king's daughter, Ariadne, and Ariadne gives Theseus some red twine, which Theseus unravels to get to the center of the labyrinth. He slays the Minotaur. He spools the thread back up. He gets out of there. He takes Ariadne, and the two of them, they leave town. And so this is some sort of great hero thing. But as I was just saying, like, what did the Minotaur do wrong? He was just a kid that was born the way he was born, and his dad didn't like it. And so he threw him in the dungeon and called it quits. So I personally, as a queer person, I mean, that is my most intimate relationship with the Minotaur. Is just, you know, as a queer person in America, especially growing up in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, like just being told that you should just stay in the closet and it's your fault that you're in there and you're a terrible person and all that. You know what I mean? That's insane. That's a horrible thing to tell anybody. And so instead of thinking of the Minotaur as this monster, perhaps we could think about this Minotaur as not trying to get us, but feeling hurt that we've gotten it. And so instead of entering the labyrinth like Theseus to try to slay the monster, what if we entered the labyrinth with a little bit of tenderness and just said, like, hey, buddy, how you doing? So that's the Greek myth and my sort of understanding of it, which is slightly from a different perspective than the general telling. And so I thought, okay, well, so a garden needs to have a theme, just like anything, even like this conversation between you and I, like there has to be a theme. Like any creative project has to have some sort of through line, even if the through line is randomness, like, but you know what the through line is. So I thought, oh, here's my through line. So that's the myth. And then when we walk the physical labyrinth, we physically walk to the center of a labyrinth. And the idea with meditation is that we're sort of walking into the center of our hearts and we're seeing what sort of Minotaur is in the center of our own spirit. And maybe that Minotaur is celebrating some beautiful news, or maybe that Minotaur is feeling just so beaten down by the world, or maybe the Minotaur is beating itself up. I mean, you know, anything's possible, and most things are probable. So that happens to us on a spiritual level when we walk. And then I thought, well, what if we applied the same logic to the land? Because I just don't think that we're so different from the land, from the plants, from the animals. I mean, we're all quite literally made from the same stuff. We come from the same place and we're going to the same place. So I thought, like, what's the Minotaur in the land? And if the Minotaur inside of myself is really like my inner self that has been hurt, what is the like sort of inner self of the land that has been hurt? What harm has it seen? What beauty? What pain? So I asked the land, and I asked it both in a sort of embodied way, which is to say I just sat there and I just listened. And then I also just did a ton of research about the land just to learn about its history, the same way that like you and I ask one another questions to learn about our history. But the land doesn't speak English, so I had to go to the library and read a bunch of documents. So this land has experienced so much. I mean, the land initially was stolen by the British from the Quinnipiac in the 1630s. And then this particular piece of land was the home to this guy, Oliver Winchester, who was a gun manufacturer back in the late 1800s. And his gun was used for a lot of I mean, guns are pretty violent.
And that's the same Winchester family as the Winchester Mystery House, which is in San Jose, which is right near me, and it is such a violent story.
Yeah, it's just such a truly gruesome story. Yeah, so that guy whose product really like destroyed just countless lives. His home, his mansion was on the property of the Divinity School. Basically, I went through tons of history. Like I went through property records and deeds, and I went to the Connecticut State Library because I just wanted to know like what's going on here, man. And so just for like hundreds of years, this land has just been treated so poorly. And the result is that, like I said in the beginning, like the garden we had was just very flat. It was sort of ecologically underutilized. The soil was like full of broken glass and it was compacted and there was not good like air or water or nutrient cycling. It wasn't attracting much wildlife. So it just felt like the land was sort of expressing a physical manifestation of the results of all of this violence. So I thought, how can I create a garden that, in the same way that, like, if you, Paula, were hurting, and I would say, like, hey, like, how's it going? Like, do you want a glass of water or something or a bandage? So, like, what could I offer this space? And I'm a gardener, so I could offer a garden. And so I did. And so I used native plants. I sourced them from growers that I really respect. I used a labor force to help install the garden that was partially made up of people who were formerly incarcerated who have such a hard time getting work because that's so stigmatized. So I tried to bring that into the process. And now the garden is just like flourishing. There used to be a dozen species of plants, and now there's like 5 dozen species of plants. I see birds and pollinators, and the people are there a lot more than they used to be. So it just feels like, I mean, we do what we can do. And so I did what I could do.
Thank you. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story too, because I think the labyrinth leaves room for all things, really. And there there's 2 things that I definitely hear there. And one is very much about the physical space. Anybody that was at YDS in the late 90s, this is when the school was literally falling apart. To hear what you've just said and be introduced to you and see someone that's actually bringing life to a place that's so foundational and beautiful and formative for so many people, it just makes my spirit sing to know that like you cared so much. So thank you. Thank you for that. 'Cause I remember calling my mom, there was a phone booth. Get that, kids, a payphone. It was underneath the chapel, there was this phone booth, and I called my mom, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this place is falling apart." And it was just really hard, like, I couldn't decide if I wanted to go there because this didn't seem to be, like, the major university that, you think about when you think about Yale. The other thing that I see that's it's just this really interesting tie-in there that in difficult times and really hard situations, the labyrinth seems to become more popular again. The recent rise is due to a woman named Lauren Artress who brought the labyrinth back to the States again. She was with Grace Cathedral in San Francisco and she was ministering to people who didn't know what to do with the AIDS epidemic. And so there was a lot of grief and sadness and confusion. Um, oh my gosh, and look at Chris. He has all these beautiful sunbeams coming in
Oh,
right now. This is striking. um, but so she went on sabbatical with a friend because she was so worn out and she didn't know what to do with all this grief and confusion that she was carrying, and she was so distressed. And she went to Chartres, France with a friend, and she saw the labyrinth in the middle of the cathedral, and she said, "I'm walking this." And after she did, she said, "I'm bringing this back to San Francisco." And her story is that the labyrinth gave her this place to walk and to experience grief and gave her a place just to be. And then when she brought it back, it allowed so many other people that were really grieving and afraid, and it it gave them all a place just to be. And so now Grace Cathedral has 2 of them. There's a match of the medieval Chartres, labyrinth that's in the center of the church, and then there's another one that is outside, and it's the same basic archetype. There's so many through lines with her story. It's just so striking.
Yeah, exactly. It just feels like the labyrinth is like perfectly on that line between intelligible and unintelligible. Like it's so mysterious. It doesn't pretend that your problems for you or anything. You don't even really know like why it's powerful. Like it's just a squiggly line going to a circle that you could just walk to in 4 steps. Like you're like what is it? But it's just so big and beyond.
Well, and I wanna thank you too, Chris, because 'cause I've told you, but when I did my studies, the Minotaur wasn't really addressed because I mean, I'm assuming, of course, there's something difficult about how do we integrate that kind of a story because it's kind of a messy story. And I think there's something about you wrestling with that truth and wrestling with who you are, and it just all meshes together. Because on this show, at least, I like to talk a lot about being in the messy middle. The Minotaur really is the story of the messy middle. Like, where do we find ourselves and how can we embrace who we really are? Why does it get really hard sometimes? And like, what is the Minotaur doing in there? Like, I'm here for this because it's just really a story about love.
Yeah, totally. I just went to this like luncheon where we were all getting to know each other, and we were asked to write down like why do you feel that you belong here? Not that was that sounds antagonistic, but it was a real question. Why do you feel that you belong here, and what makes you feel disconnected? And it was so wild because it was so easy to write my response for both of those, which was why do I belong here? Because everyone belongs. Like belonging is the default. Like why would you ever not belong? But why do I feel disconnected? I wrote is because oftentimes, especially in this world, like I'm a white man, and even this garden that I created, I'm still a white man gardening on stolen land. So like everyone does belong, but also we live in this complicated world where our identities do mean something also, and that can be really confusing. So the reason I say this is like the messy middle is that on the one hand, I personally very much believe that we all belong and we should make sure that we all know that. And on the other hand, I very much often feel like I don't belong and nor should I belong. And so even within myself, and I know I'm not alone, like we're most of us are pretty insecure much of the time, which is why I feel perfectly comfortable revealing some insecurities sometimes. But that messy middle where I'm like, I know I belong, and I also know that I don't.
Well, and that is the dance right there.
And I think the second one is not true, but I feel that it's as true as the first one. You know what I mean?
I mean, that is the messy middle of feeling whatever the word is that one might choose about belonging or worthiness or being good enough.
Oh my God.
I'm just trying to think of some of my own, my own questions. Like, who do you think you are? Is usually that angry question that comes up in me. Who are you to do this? Fill in the blank.
Totally. For me, it's often the tone. It's like, walking into the labyrinth and not saying like, what's wrong with you? But saying like, how's it going?
Yeah. And I think that is the question.
Yeah, what happened? You seem awfully distraught.
And when you can keep in touch with what feels right, what you know for sure, to use an Oprah question, I think you find your way through it. But there's something else you have to be clinging to, right? When the really hard stuff hits. That's where I'm jumping to. That's why I love what you're saying to the Minotaur and that's how you're approaching the land and the story of all of it. Hey, what happened? How can I help? And it's so interesting because I think Divinity School, at least Yale, gives you the space for all of these questions and all of these discussions just to be okay. And I surely hadn't run into a community or the place where that would have been allowed before I went to Yale.
Yeah, what a privilege to ask questions, period.
Well, and maybe it's not fair to ask this question right now because you don't have to know where you're headed, but where do you think you'd like this to go after YDS for you?
So I'm in my third out of 3 years at YDS. So this question is very present on my mind. So back to my company in New York, one reason that I think I used the word disillusioned with it is because, like any industry, I could have just sort of turned my business into like a big business and, tried to be a fancy guy and make money and just put gardens that to me didn't seem particularly like ecologically interesting or even aesthetically interesting, and just like serve people with lots of money and be happy with that. And I'm not just saying this to be politically correct, but I think that's a perfectly fine way to go. It just wasn't for me. So for me, I just needed to build in, and I didn't know how to build this in, which is why I went to divinity school. And now I have a little bit more idea. I just had to build in this sort of spiritual restorative practice component. So now that I've had that, I actually don't mind the model that I had for my business, but if it could be amplified with what I just was talking about. So I could imagine myself starting another company, having my labor force at least partially be based in like a vocational training program, so that I basically want every part of my business to be talking to the Minotaur of that section of the business. So like I want to get my plants and materials from companies that are really respecting the land and one another. It would be so great to be teaching young people, or again, people who are formerly incarcerated who just don't get chances the way that other folks do, to sort of make the labor a generative process in and of itself. And then to maybe work for schools, or I would like to do more public gardening than private. That way more people can appreciate it. And those spaces tend to be larger. So there's more of an impact ecologically. So yeah, do like churches, schools, hospitals, community spaces, and bring in the storytelling more so that people, because for me, gardening, as we're talking about, is like, it's a spiritual endeavor, it's a historical, it's social, it's about queerness, it's about gender, it's about power, patriarchy. Like, so if I can start to talk about gardening with people, because most people don't actually like care about gardening. Like most people think like, oh, that's pretty, whatever. But it would be so cool to engage people in such a dynamic way around gardening.
Just knowing you for a short amount of time, you've really changed my heart around what the labyrinth means and how we can show up. This conversation is just bringing an image to mind of one of the very first retreats that I attended, the one that I was talking about earlier in this conversation. I really felt like I had lost my way and I didn't understand where my home was. I'd kind of lost that sense of home and place. And in this reconciliation ceremony, um, Father Evan, he just put his hands on my shoulders and he said, "Welcome home."
God, wow.
And in this one moment, it like changed everything.
Yeah.
And so lots of times I find myself looking at it and wondering, how can you change? How can you be in the moment? And and this conversation is even making me wonder, like, maybe in my own labyrinth work, can I take it to maybe prisons or places where people aren't necessarily being welcomed in their own way? So thank you. I mean, really, the work you're doing here is just so inspiring and I'm honored that I get to be in your orbit.
Oh my God, likewise. Yeah, we're just orbiting. We're just dancing. I guess that.
Yes. Okay. So before we wrap up, where can people find you if they're curious about what you do and want to see some of your past work? Where would you point them?
Well, I don't have any social media, so unfortunately that gets rid of so many options. It's just my website, which is C like Charlie, F like Frank, Gardens with an S on the end of it, .com, cfgardens.com. And if you want to contact me, you can go to the contact page.
Because I was so delighted to talk to you. I didn't even ask you the first question I ask everyone, which is so weird. So let's jump to our last question, which is, what are three ways that you can think of to jumpstart joy in your life, in the world, or in other people's lives?
This is such a fun question. And what a cool question to like get to survey all of your guests. I think the first thing would be to do what you love, partially because you'll do it really well. And there's a niche for everything. So you might as well do what you love because someone's going to really want you to do that. And it's just like, so when I see someone else doing something they love, especially when it's something weird, it like inspires me so much. I'm like, oh, I'm allowed to do the weird things that I love. Um, so that's the first thing, which is so convenient that doing what you love is like good for other people. And then I think being kind, just trying to be kind, like even when you don't want to be, which for me is like more often than you might think based on this interview. you know, like, like most of us walk around and have some thoughts that are not so nice or charitable toward, the other people in traffic, for example.
I mean, I talk about joy on the podcast, and yes, I also have those moments where I'm like, ah.
Yeah, right. So, it's not like what thought do you have, but what do you do with it? So I think it's really important to be kind if and when it's possible. And then the third is to direct your energy and like the thing that you love and the kindness, like direct it toward those who are especially in need of it. So, for example, everyone could benefit from the Labyrinth, but some folks could go to Grace Cathedral every other day, but people in prison cannot go to Grace Cathedral every other day. And that's something I'm constantly working on because I feel like it's easy just to hang out with my group of friends and my clients and all of that. So to try to engage my work outside of my bubbles.
I'm even just thinking of in small business circles, the focus is so much you've got to be on social media, you got to be, but like, where are we really going to help anyone there? So I love all of these so much. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Yeah, thanks for the prompt to think about them. It's really helpful.
And thank you so much for being on the show. I'm just delighted to be able to meet you in person and to be able to lead the Labyrinth walk with you in the amazing space that you have curated.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so very much.
Truly, my heart is glad.
Yale Divinity School Labyrinth. I'm Paula Jenkins. I'm an MAR from 1998, and I am also an advanced labyrinth facilitator for Minotaur, which I can explain a little bit more in a bit. And this is my Cobra member.
I'm Christopher Freimuth. I'm in third year right now.
And we'll get into more about his role here as well. But before we start...